Thank you for joining us for this segment of SHIPS, which stands for Ships, History, Influence, and Power series. My name is Amy Bachari, and I am the Education Director at the Steamship Historical Society of America, and today you'll hear from Ted Scull. In addition to his past work as a teacher, Ted is an author, travel writer, and lecturer specializing in destinations, maritime and railway subjects, and New York City. He served as chairman of the World Ship Society Port of New York branch and as president of the Steamship Historical Society. Ted worked for Holland America Line from 1964 to 1966 in sales promotion. It was here that he witnessed the major changes to Manhattan's waterfront. The container revolution was taking over from the breakbulk ships that were loaded and unloaded along the city's waterfront. Long stretches were abandoned for years. Increases in air travel took over from point-to-point passenger ship travel, and ocean liners were replaced by leisure travel aboard cruise ships. You will also hear from Stuart Gewirtzman, whose childhood fascination with ships and trains led him to a 33-year career as a transportation planning consultant in New York City with a focus on transit and ferry services. He also serves on the board of directors of the World Ship Society Port of New York branch. Stuart will share photographs he took of Manhattan's waterfront and the ships you may see in the harbor today. To learn more about ships, visit shiphistory.org/ships.
The handling of cargo on and off ships changed radically in the 1960s with the use of 40-foot steel containers packed at the factory that, for example, produced Chinese-manufactured computer equipment or clothing. Handling small amounts of cargo by placing it on pallets or in nets and swinging it into the cargo holds would largely disappear. Loading the containers took place at the nearest port, such as Shanghai, and deliver them directly to the Port of New York. But now, not at Manhattan or Brooklyn piers, rather at the new terminals at Port Newark or Port Elizabeth in New Jersey. A truck would then haul the containers and deliver them directly to the customer. The effect on New York's waterfront was devastating. The old finger piers, the long, narrow piers that were in use for years and years and years to the beginning of the 20th century, were now largely useless for cargo, and hundreds of waterfront jobs disappeared. This video will also show the transformation of the multi-class ocean liner that plied the Atlantic from New York en route to and from European ports to ships that now largely provide pleasure cruises, with an occasional transatlantic crossing by the Queen Mary tube. The following presentation will illustrate the aforesaid revolution using mostly photographs I took when I moved to New York in early 1960s and worked for Holland America Line at their Pier 40 waterfront location. My office on Pier 40 was a window into the port's activities. The view we're looking at now is Pier 40 at the foot of West Houston Street on the Manhattan side of the North River or Hudson River. So we've got here a square pier as opposed to what you see in the background is the finger piers, little narrow piers that jut into the river. And this was Holland America Line's headquarters, and the city was trying to save the cargo and passenger trade for some of the piers on the Manhattan side. And this was the first example. A square pier that can hold, in this case, can hold 3 ships at one time. You've got the New Amsterdam at the bottom, which was Holland America Line's flagship for a long time. And then on the riverside, you could see a small freighter, which was typical of the type of freighters that came once a week to be loaded in the old-fashioned way. And then in the center, you see a few trucks, and you can see some containers. And then on the roof, you can see a line of cars to the left, because some passengers, when they came, for instance, to do a cruise to Bermuda and back, which might be, 4 days or 5 days, they would park their car on the pier, which is something you couldn't do at other piers. Now, this is the Holland America Line's piers over in Hoboken before they moved to Manhattan in 1961. And you can see a passenger ship in the middle ground, and that's the Stottendam. And then below is a cargo terminal, and you can see it's very cramped. You've got 3 ships surrounding what looks like a relatively new shed, but almost no space to really handle cargo properly. Back to Pier 40, you see it here with 2 ships on the left side. There was an extension to the pier that you don't really see, so they could handle 2 cargo ships at the same time and also 2 passenger vessels. Now, one of the joys of living in New York was in certain parts of the city, like Greenwich Village here, you could look left and you might see a ship at the end of the street. And of course, this was the Holland America Line ship, Rotterdam, looking at us on a nice snowy morning. Now, the entrance to Pier 40, which I use every day for about 3 years, I showed this mural before you went upstairs to the offices showing 4 Rotterdams. They liked repeating the names of ships because there was a continuity to it, and also it more easily identified it was a Holland America Line ship than anybody else's. Now, these 3 guys here are on board one of the Holland America Line ships. I'm in the middle, of course, and 2 Dutchmen who work for the company. One on the left, Lawrence van der Laan, I work with every day. We were in sales promotion, thinking of all sorts of ideas to draw passengers to the Holland America Line sailings to and from Europe, from England, France, and Holland mostly. The man on the right was the public relations man, Paul Deinhauer. We had a wonderful time together. We're going to look at a departure of the New Amsterdam, and one of the joys of the past was that when a ship was embarking passengers, which was usually 4 hours before sailing time, passengers could come aboard with friends and relatives, and they simply paid $1 or $2 or $3 to the Seamen's Charities, and they walked aboard, and they could spend about 3 hours on the ship, and there were all sorts of parties and things like that. And then after the party was over, they would disembark and then watch the ship sail. And here's the New Amsterdam reversing into the North River or the Hudson River. This was a ship that was built just after the war by Royal Rotterdam Lloyd, and it was a beautiful passenger ship for its day that sailed between Rotterdam and the Dutch East Indies. That journey would usually take about close to a month. Now, the Caronia, which you see here as the Caribia, was Cunard Line's first purpose-built cruise ship, as opposed to carrying passengers from A to B. It did worldwide cruises, and it was very, very popular. It was built just after the Second World War, where Cunard began to see the handwriting on the wall that cruising was going to be a big deal. And this ship got too old to use, and until they could find a buyer or someone to take it to be scrapped, it was between 2 piers on the west side of Manhattan for a couple of years, and it was interesting to be able to go down and see it. And occasionally they would give tours. There wasn't much going on inside, but it was a reminiscent of what had been one time a grand cruise ship. This is obviously the Rotterdam sailing, and NASM was the Dutch, and it was translated into English, not a sober moment, by the passengers who were on board the ship having a good time. And here you have the passengers seeing their families or friends off. They probably had a nice party, and you can see the number of people on the ship. And then here, I took this picture. This was when I was heading to London to do a master's degree, and I sailed on the Rotterdam. I had quit my job at Holland America Line. And you could see there are actually hundreds of people on the pier. And there was something like 400 or 500 people that were on the ship seeing us off, friends and family. And it was really quite a sailing. You would be assigned a table, so you would get together for lunch and you get together for dinner. You wore a jacket and tie for dinner. You were required to wear, but that was normal. You met people, on the ship, and you were with them for, a week. We had a great time. Holland America Line Pier with one of the freighters that would arrive on a Monday, be working offloading and loading Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then it would sail off. Today, what would happen if this was a small container ship is they could arrive at 8 o'clock in the morning and they'd probably sail at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're in the middle of the river looking back at Pier 40, and there is one of the cargo vessels. This was a cargo passenger vessel called the Westerdam. It carried about 100 passengers. Well, it's raining or has been raining, and you see these black tent-like structures to protect the holds from the rain, filling up the cargo holds, and also keep the rain off the longshoremen as they're working the cargo. The Holland America Line also represented some of the cargo ships that sailed out of New York, Dutch cargo ships. And this is KNSM, which is Royal Netherlands Steamship Company. And they ran about 35 ships from New York and New Orleans to the West Indies and the north coast of South America. And most of the schedules were once a week, and they all carried 12 passengers. And they were extremely popular with passengers. They were very small ships, and you can see 2 decks of passenger accommodation. And people could spend, maybe 4 days to get from New York to some islands, and they may stay on the island for a week, and then the next ship would come along and pick them up and bring them back to New York. Of course, all that disappeared with containerization. But it was really fun to see them off. They were beautiful little ships. This was Norwegian America Line, and they had freighters that came in, little small ones, and then they had passenger vessels that came in too, mostly taking cruises by now, but they would also make transatlantic crossings as well. Now, the piers started at Pier A and then Pier 1, and they went all the way up to Pier 92, I think. And then above that were the car float piers, where the New York Central Railroad would bring over barges to the transfer bridges, which you see over on the right. You can see that building with the little spikes on the top. The freight cars would be rolled off there and then connected to the railroad on the land side. And here there's been some sabotage. These facilities were shut down permanently. Now, the Great White Fleet used Pier 1 and 3. This is 3, and the vessel there is a Greek 12-passenger breakbulk ship owned by Hellenic Line. And they had quite a large fleet that went all over the world, and they made also great cruises for passengers. And it's using the United Fruit Company pier. And this is one of the United Fruit Company vessels that is leaving to go off back to Central America and bring back some more Chiquita bananas. And they were white hulled. This one is a lot of rust here. They would do painting once they got to South America because they had to spend a couple of days in port loading the bananas. And of course, when they were put into containers, it was all done at the farms where the bananas were picked and then moved onto the ship right away. And then the ship would sail when they had enough containers to make it worthwhile. A typical attractive breakbulk ship, some people would call this a stick ship because of all the cargo handling gear that was looking like sticks. And each one of these represented a different hold. So this had 3 holds forward and 1 aft, and the cargo would be hoisted on board by these in slings or baskets or so on. But they were very attractive cargo ships to look at. And you could tell the company very easily by its funnel marking here is Turkish Maritime Lines, and they had quite a large fleet that served New York. And they also carried 12 passengers as well, so you could sail from New York to Istanbul. Now we got an American shipping company, Luckenbach, and you can see it's working its cargo here, and all the cranes and paraphernalia that would have to haul the cargo aboard on pallets or any slings and sacks and all that kind of stuff. Now, some of the pier heads, and the pier head was a term used for the front of the pier that faced the city, were really quite attractive. And it's interesting that you had railroads involved in this. Well, the railroads had railroad navies, and the railroads all came to the New Jersey side of the Hudson River. And if they had a lot of cargo to move across, the boxcars that we would see on railroads, we would put on barges, and tugs would tow them across to the railroad facilities, which was a pier on the Manhattan side, and offloaded. The cars could be hooked up to the New York Central line on the west side, or would go back empty and then pick up the next cargo. Now, here's an example of a finger pier that's been abandoned. You'll see more of it in a minute, and one of the New York City fireboats that would be stationed in certain parts of the harbor. And that's Pier 56, which are at the Chelsea piers down in the West 20s. This has now been demolished pretty much except for the actual flat part of the bed. Everything else has been demolished. But you can see what was once wonderful design with a lot of areas for passengers to see their friends or relationships off. They could come down to the end of these piers. They could look, if it was raining, they could look through these windows, and all the activity took place on the inside. And this was the same pier facing New York City. And these are quite impressive head houses, as you can see. It was substantially built. This one has been abandoned. And eventually everything will be torn down except for the middle part, the recessed part. And it will be a walkway onto the pier is just simply a flat, open space rather than a building itself. And then here you have the beginning of what is going to be ubiquitous. This is sea train lines, and they called it sea train lines because these cargo ships originally would transfer boxcars from the railroads on the other side onto the ships and then carried down to the West Indies, or they were put into containers at the car float facilities. Instead of bringing it across the river, they would put it on a ship that was now carrying containers down to the West Indies, to Puerto Rico particularly. It was their regular service.
While most of the harbor's cargo piers were demolished, as much of the waterfront was redeveloped for commercial, residential, and recreational uses, some finger piers survive, often serving other purposes. One such example is Pier 57, bordering Manhattan's West Village neighborhood. Built to an innovative design in 1954 by New York City for the Grace Line to replace an earlier pier destroyed by fire, this handsome Art Deco-style pier has been repurposed to office space for Google, along with a food hall and a rooftop recreational space. A more striking example of the changes along Manhattan's Hudson River waterfront is Little Island at the former location of Pier 54, which was originally used by the famous White Star and Cunard lines. At the site where the Titanic's survivors disembarked from the Carpathia and the Lusitania set sail on her ill-fated voyage, now sits a striking 2.4-acre artificial island park with an amphitheater, landscaped pathways, and sweeping views of the Hudson River. Another somewhat less radical example of waterfront redevelopment can be found at Pier 66 Maritime on the Hudson River, which is now the site of a public boathouse and where a former railroad car float has been converted to a very popular drinking and dining venue. It is also home to two historic vessels seen in this photo: the retired FDNY fireboat John J. Harvey, built in 1931, and the former 1929 lightship Frying Pan, a floating lighthouse that originally guarded its namesake shoals off Cape Fear, North Carolina. Although ocean-going cargo ships no longer call at Manhattan, the Manhattan Cruise Terminal at the edge of the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood still plays host to numerous cruise ships throughout the year. It is one of 3 cruise ship terminals in the harbor, the others being the Brooklyn Cruise Terminal in Red Hook and the Cape Liberty Cruise Port in Bayonne, New Jersey. Here we see Norwegian Cruise Line's Norwegian Breakaway at Pier 88, one of 2 renovated finger piers at the terminal. While the last true transatlantic liner, Cunard's Queen Mary II, calls at Brooklyn, her fleet mates will occasionally call at Manhattan. In this photo, we see the Queen Elizabeth outbound on the Hudson River, in an image from the grounds of the Stevens Institute in Hoboken, New Jersey. And here we have a view of Holland America Line's Rotterdam as she makes her maiden departure from New York. Commissioned in 2021, she is the 7th Holland America Line ship to carry that name and the current flagship of the fleet. Like the Manhattan waterfront, New Jersey's Hudson River waterfront has also transitioned from its industrial past. Compare this 1985 view of Cunard's Saga Fjord sailing past remnants of the vast rail yards, piers, and warehouses that once lined the Jersey City and Hoboken waterfronts to these views of the Jersey City waterfront today. Most of the industrial and rail freight uses have given way to office, residential, and hotel development. Not all waterfront railroading has vanished, however. A last vestige of the harbor's once extensive railroad car float operations can still be found transporting rail cars on barges between Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and Greenville, New Jersey. Although containerization spelled the end of marine cargo operations in Manhattan and along much of the Brooklyn and New Jersey waterfronts, the Port of New York and New Jersey is still the busiest port on the East Coast of the United States. On any given day, you'll see a wide variety of ships engaged in global commerce, as demonstrated by this view of two very different outbound ships, the K-Line car carrier Texas Highway and Royal Caribbean's cruise ship Liberty of the Seas. Many of the marine cargo operations at the port are now located at facilities on Newark Bay, including at Port Elizabeth, Port Newark, and Howland Hook on Staten Island. Ships access these facilities via the Kilvan Cull, a tidal strait between Staten Island, New York, and Bayonne, New Jersey. Here we see several images of Taiwan-based Evergreen Marine's container ship Ever Ready, outbound on the Kilvan Cull. In the first of these photos, we see a portion of the Bayonne Bridge, which was built in 1931 and had its roadway raised by 64 feet in 2019 to accommodate the increasing size of container ships. The Kilvan Cull is a busy and relatively narrow waterway, and it's common to see tugboats escorting large vessels to and from their berth, as in this image of Denmark-based Maersk Line's container ship Gunhild Maersk being escorted by two Moran towing tugs, the Jonathan Moran and the Kirby Moran. And this is where the Gunhild Maersk was sailing to, the Port Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminals on Newark Bay. These are the principal container ship terminals in the port. In this view, you can get a sense of the size of the ship-to-shore cranes used to load and unload the containers. In addition to cargo and cruise ships, a wide array of other vessels can be seen plying the harbor's waterways. One of the most ubiquitous are tugboats, which, in addition to assisting the docking of large ocean-going vessels, also play an important role transporting bulk cargoes locally via barge. As shown in these next few images, a variety of designs and liveries can be seen in the harbor. In this photo, we see Don John Marine Company tugboat Paul Andrew on a foggy day in Newark Bay. This handsome tug is McAllister Towing's McAllister Responder, seen here on the Kilvan Cull. McAllister Towing was founded in New York Harbor in 1864. It is still owned by the McAllister family, although today its vessels operate along the entire East Coast from Maine to Puerto Rico. Here we see Moran Towing's Kirby Moran assisting the departure of a ship from the Manhattan Cruise Terminal. Moran Towing was originally founded by an Irish immigrant named Michael Moran, who got his start driving a mule-pulled barge along the Erie Canal in 1850. This photo shows a tugboat pushing an empty fuel barge through Buttermilk Channel with Governor's Island and the lower Manhattan skyline in the background. And here we see the Rheinauer Transportation Company tugboat Jill Rheinauer assisting her larger fleet mate, the pusher tug Meredith C. Rheinauer, with an empty petroleum barge. All three vessels wear the company's distinctive beige and red livery. This is Dan Marine Towing Company's ocean-going tugboat Discovery Coast on the East River. Note the tall pagoda-like superstructure designed to provide the pilot with a clear view when pushing a barge riding high in the water. U.S. Coast Guard vessels are also frequently seen in the harbor and surrounding waters. Here we see one of their medium response boats on patrol in the Upper Bay. And this image shows their ice-breaking tugboat Thunder Bay off Manhattan's Tribeca neighborhood. On the right is one of the vent buildings for the Holland Tunnel. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is also an important federal presence in the harbor. In addition to monitoring the conditions of the harbor's federally maintained navigation channels, the Corps operates a small fleet of drift collection vessels that help to keep the waterways clear of debris that may damage boats and ships. Here we see two of their fleet, the Gelberman, decked out to welcome the arrival of a visiting U.S. Navy ship, and the Driftmaster, passing the clock tower of New Jersey Transit's Hoboken Terminal. After 9/11, the FDNY identified a need for new, more powerful fireboats, and the result was construction of two of the largest fireboats yet built, the 343 and Firefighter II. Here we see the 343, named after the number of FDNY personnel lost on 9/11, passing the former Jersey Central Railroad terminal. Boats of the NYPD Harbor Unit also play a critical role in responding to emergencies, as well as providing security along the hundreds of miles of New York City waterfront. Many of the department's harbor launches are named after members killed in the line of duty, including Launch 701, the patrolman Philip Cardillo, seen here passing the former immigration station on Ellis Island. Another New York City agency with a presence in the harbor is the Department of Environmental Protection, which operates a fleet of unremarked but important ships, sludge tankers that carry the residual organic material that is removed from wastewater to treatment plants where it can be further processed. Here we see the DEP sludge tanker North River heading down the East River off Roosevelt Island. And now I'll hand the program back over to Ted.
I'm going to start off with the Circle Line. Here you see it where they spend the night at the end of West 42nd Street. The Circle Line started operating sightseeing cruises in 1945, and its most ambitious one is the Circuit of Manhattan, which is 35 miles and takes about a little less than 3 hours. It's one of the most ubiquitous sites that you see, and they have a whole line of different short and long cruises. Here's a Circle Line vessel up on the East River with the RFK, Robert F. Kennedy Bridge, and the Hellgate Railroad Bridge. The Hellgate Railroad Bridge is the one in behind, and it connects the railroad between New York and Boston over the Hell Gate, which is the waterway that gives entrance to Long Island Sound. This is one of the NYC ferries owned by the city of New York, and they operate between all boroughs, all 5 boroughs. It's one of the newest advances to using the rivers and the bays for transportation that allow people to, for instance, along the East River, you have a large number of high-rise apartment houses. Well, when they were finished, people who went to work on Wall Street or in Lower Manhattan had to walk a number of blocks inland to get the subway. This way they could walk out their front door and get on a ferry and be in Lower Manhattan in 15 minutes. They run everywhere, and if you want to come and see different parts of New York, then you pay a flat fare. This is the Jersey Central Railroad Terminal, which we've mentioned before. It brought the Central New Jersey, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and a couple of others to the Jersey side of the Hudson River. And from there, passengers from the trains would switch to a ferry over to Manhattan, either the Upper West Side or directly across to the Wall Street area. It's a particularly beautiful building at nighttime when it's lit up. And then a similar building as far as function goes is the Lackawanna Terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. And you can see the 6 bays for ferries. This terminal was built at the beginning of the 20th century and is very much used today. It's the terminal for the New Jersey Transit trains that come into Hoboken if they don't go into Penn Station. Here we have the Staten Island Ferry, New York's biggest ferry operation. They have boats that carry about 4,500 passengers. There's a sailing normally every half hour. It's more frequent during the rush hour, and it operates 24 hours a day. And this is another view of it, and you get the color of the Staten Island Ferry, which is really quite attractive, I think. It's a 25-minute ride, then it's free from the Battery to St. George, and you have to get off if you're going to go back again immediately. It's a wonderful way to see the harbor. Here's a nice picture, and in fact, we have Stuart on the deck of the Staten Island Ferry with another one passing. And there you see very much the same picture, but you're passing the Statue of Liberty all lit up at night as well. A nice view of Lower Manhattan. The sun is just going down. It's reflecting on the last 2 or 3 buildings, and the tallest building, obviously, is the World Trade Center off to the left. You can go out into the harbor in a number of sightseeing vessels, including this vessel, which is named the Adirondack, and it sails from West 23rd Street. There are a couple of these, and they make wonderful, wonderful trips, and it's very atmospheric. This was a private charter that I was on that happens every year, and I know most of the people on that boat. We were out there for about 3 or 4 hours, and it's just wonderful to go from the daylight down to nighttime and being in the harbor. There we are with the Holland America Line ship Rotterdam, leaving New York and passing under the Manhattan Bridge, looking at the lower skyline of Manhattan on the east side. the Manhattan Bridge with a very tall apartment house next to it. There's supposed to be 2 more built. They are right at the edge of Chinatown and are not very popular with people who like the traditional skyline of New York. This is very much out of scale. Another lovely picture, the sun has gone down and the lights have come on in Lower Manhattan. I'm aboard the Queen Mary II coming across the Atlantic at the end of a voyage from Southampton, England. And this is about 5:45 in the morning. I'm out on deck and I'm looking at the Statue of Liberty. And it's here that the Queen Mary II will come into the port, then make a complete U-ey, and then back into its berth in Brooklyn. And there's another picture of the full moon and the Statue of Liberty. And a little brighter now, I'm looking out over the swimming pool at the Lower Manhattan over Governor's Island. And here I'm out on deck waiting for the boat to be cleared. You can see Governor's Island to the left. The waterway is Buttermilk Channel, and then it runs up under the bridges you see in the far distance, which is the East River, which then joins in with the Long Island Sound. One of the nice advantages that Cunard offers is that if you can carry your own bag off the ship, as soon as it's cleared by Customs and Immigration, you can simply walk off. And very often the gates will open as close as 6:45 in the morning, 15 minutes after the ship is docked. This is the ship docked in Brooklyn at a former cargo terminal. And it sails from here. We'll watch it sail now. Here we are on the Staten Island Ferry, and the Queen Mary II is left at about 6 o'clock, and it's coming up behind us and will pass us. And it looks very, very large from the Staten Island Ferry. You feel you're on a large ferry, and then you see one of the largest ships in the world slide by. It was really quite exciting. I mean, it was just energizing. And of course, the people on board are looking at this lovely Staten Island Ferry, which are very, very attractive and waving back and forth. Looking back, and there's the Queen Mary II, and you can see the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in the background on the left. And there we are up on Staten Island, looking down on one of the old forts to protect the harbor against the British. And here we've got the Queen Mary II passing a chemical tanker. It's about to pass under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. It's a very nice sequence of pictures. And Stuart and I were actually together there when we took that picture some years ago now. The closest clearance that the funnel comes to the underside of the bridge is 9 feet. And so the designer of the Queen Mary II would have loved to have had a taller funnel, but if he had done that, it would have been trapped in New York for the rest of its life. So he had to shorten it. And that's the Queen Mary II heading off to Southampton. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Ships. To learn more about our organization, visit sshsa.org.